I watched through my binoculars as the bulldozers rolled onto my family's 160-acre ranch at dawn, their diesel engines shattering the morning silence. Board President Catherine Wexford stood beside a man in a hard hat, pointing toward the ancient oak grove where my grandfather's cattle used to graze, gesturing like she owned every blade of grass. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the HOA Community Center, where they held their monthly meetings, the office where they filed their fraudulent paperwork, and the parking lot where Catherine's Mercedes sat gleaming, all belonged to me. I owned their entire world, and they'd just declared war on mine. But this nightmare began 18 months earlier, when I thought I was finally coming home after 15 years building tech companies in Silicon Valley. The call about Grandpa Joe's passing hit me like a freight train. Joe Richardson had been more than family. He was the last connection to a simpler world, a 160-acre ranch in Texas Hill Country, where time moved slower and problems were solved with handshakes instead of lawsuits. The funeral was everything Grandpa would have wanted. Half the county showed up, sharing stories about the man who'd helped them through droughts, lent equipment without asking questions, and never forgot a birthday. Standing beside his grave, surrounded by rolling hills and endless sky, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done with Silicon Valley. Done with 70-hour weeks and venture capital meetings. The ranch was mine now, and I was going to honor Grandpa's memory by making it work again. The property was stunning, 160 acres of prime Texas land, with a spring-fed creek, mature pecan groves, and a 1,920s farmhouse that had been lovingly maintained for 3 generations. The ranch house sat on a hill overlooking the entire spread, with views that stretched to the horizon. This wasn't just land, it was legacy. What I didn't immediately notice was the cluster of modern houses that had sprouted along the eastern boundary over the past decade. Grandpa had mentioned selling a few acres for development, but I'd assumed it was just a couple of houses. From the ranch house, I could see at least 20 rooftops arranged in neat suburban rows, complete with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. It looked harmless enough. Just neighbors sharing the same beautiful countryside. I had no idea I was staring at a viper's nest. My first indication of trouble came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after moving in. I was repairing fence posts along the eastern property line when a golf cart appeared, carrying 3 people who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club brochure. The woman driving had the kind of perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She wore white tennis clothes despite the fact that there wasn't a tennis court for 20 miles, and her smile had the predatory quality of a shark sensing blood in the water. "You must be Joe Richardson's grandson," she called out, her voice honey-sweet with an undertone of steel. "I'm Catherine Wexford, president of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. These are board members, Patricia Hendricks and Robert Talbot." Patricia was a thin woman in her 60s who looked like she'd been sucking lemons since birth. Robert appeared uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with his golf cart keys, like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Jake Richardson," I said, setting down my post-hole digger. "Nice to meet you." Catherine's smile widened. "We've been so looking forward to introducing ourselves to our new neighbor." "Your grandfather was. Well, he was very set in his old ways, wasn't he?" The comment hit wrong. Grandpa Joe had been the most generous man I'd ever known, always ready to help neighbors in need. He was a good man who cared about this land and the people on it. "Oh, absolutely," Catherine said quickly. "We just mean that times change, you know? Modern communities have different standards, different expectations." Patricia leaned forward. "We noticed you've been doing quite a bit of activity along the fence line. Heavy machinery, construction sounds. We wanted to make sure you're aware of our noise ordinances." I glanced at the fence posts I'd been repairing by hand. Noise ordinances? The Meadowbrook Estates community has very specific guidelines about construction hours, noise levels, and visual impact, Catherine explained. We're sure someone with your background would want to be respectful of property values and community standards. Something cold settled in my stomach. What kind of guidelines? Catherine pulled out a tablet and began scrolling. Well, for instance, agricultural activities are restricted to certain hours. Livestock must be kept at least 500 feet from property boundaries. Any structures visible from our community require architectural approval. I looked across my family's ranch land that had been in my family for 60 years, then back at these strangers in their golf cart. You're talking about my ranch like it's subject to your homeowners association. Well, Catherine's smile became razor sharp. That's actually something we need to discuss. What followed was the most surreal conversation of my life. According to Catherine Wexford and her HOA board, my grandfather had entered into a community standards agreement 5 years earlier that subjected the ranch to certain restrictions in exchange for allowing the Meadowbrook Estates development to connect to our private road for access. It was all perfectly legal, Patricia insisted, pulling out a folder thick with documents. Your grandfather signed the agreement in 2019. Road access in exchange for compliance with reasonable community standards. I flipped through the papers, my blood pressure rising with each page. The agreement was a masterpiece of legal manipulation disguised as neighborly cooperation. Hidden in the fine print were restrictions on everything from building heights to fence types to the hours when agricultural activities could be conducted. This is insane, I muttered. You're trying to turn my ranch into suburban compliance. Robert finally spoke up, his voice apologetic. Jake, we just want to protect everyone's property values. Some of these agricultural activities can be disruptive to residential life. Agricultural activities, like what? Catherine's eyes gleamed. Like the cattle operation you've been discussing with local ranchers. Cattle can be quite noisy, and the aromatic impact on a residential community. My grandfather had run cattle on this land for 40 years. Now, these suburbanites were telling me I couldn't continue that tradition because it might inconvenience their backyard barbecues. Look, I said, fighting to keep my voice level, I appreciate your concerns, but this is a working ranch. It's been a working ranch since before your development existed. I'm not changing how I operate my family's land because you don't like the smell of cows. Catherine's mask of politeness finally slipped. Mr. Richardson, you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. The Community Standards Agreement is legally binding. If you violate its terms, the HOA has the right to pursue legal remedies. Legal remedies like what? Injunctions, fines, and, in extreme cases, she paused dramatically, forced sale of non-compliant properties. The words hung in the air like a threat. These people I'd just met were calmly informing me that they could force me to sell my family's ranch if I didn't comply with their suburban fantasy of rural life. We hope it doesn't come to that, Patricia added with fake sympathy. We're sure a reasonable person like yourself will want to be a good neighbor. As their golf cart disappeared down the private road my family had built and maintained for decades, I stood alone on land that had been in my family for 3 generations, wondering how strangers had gained the power to destroy it. That afternoon, I drove straight to the law office of Marcus Webb, the attorney who'd handled Grandpa's estate. Marcus had practiced law in the county for 30 years and knew every property dispute within 50 miles. Marcus, I need you to look at something, I said, sliding Catherine's folder across his desk. Tell me this isn't enforceable. Marcus spent 20 minutes reading through the agreement, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Finally, he set the documents down and rubbed his temples. Jake, I'm sorry to say this, but your grandfather got taken. This agreement is enforceable, and it's worse than you think. My stomach dropped. How much worse? They structured it as a perpetual easement agreement tied to the property deed. It's not just binding on you, it's binding on any future owners of the ranch. They essentially created a permanent HOA covenant over your family's land. I stared at the papers, trying to process what he was telling me. How is that possible? How could Grandpa sign away control of the ranch? Marcus pulled out another file. I've been dreading this conversation since your grandfather's funeral. Joe came to me in 2019, desperate for cash to pay for medical treatments. The cancer treatments weren't covered by Medicare, and he was looking at bankruptcy. The room started spinning. He was sick. Pancreatic cancer. He beat it, but the treatment costs nearly destroyed him financially. Catherine Wexford approached him with an offer $50,000 plus road access for their development in exchange for signing the Community Standards Agreement. $50,000 for permanent control over 160 acres? Joe was desperate, Jake. He thought he was just agreeing to be a good neighbor. I advised against it, but he needed the money immediately. Marcus leaned forward. The worst part is, they knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a desperate landowner taking advantage of desperate circumstances. This was a calculated acquisition of control over your family's property. I felt sick. My grandfather, the strongest man I'd ever known, had been manipulated in his weakest moment by these suburban vultures. Marcus, what are my options? Legally, limited. You can comply with their restrictions, or you can fight it in court for years with no guarantee of success. Marcus paused. Or you can find another way. What other way? Marcus pulled out a different file. Before we discuss that, there's something else you need to know about your inheritance. Something your grandfather never mentioned. The file Marcus opened contained documents I'd never seen before. Property deeds, business registrations, and financial records that painted a picture of my grandfather I'd never imagined. Jake, your grandfather wasn't just a rancher. He was also a real estate investor. A very successful one. The documents told an incredible story. Starting in the 1990s, Grandpa Joe had begun quietly purchasing commercial properties throughout the county. Strip malls, office buildings, even a small shopping center. He'd done it all through a holding company called Triple J Holdings, LLC, named after his 3 grandchildren. Why didn't he ever mention this? Joe was private about his business dealings. He didn't want people treating him differently because of his wealth. But Jake, Triple J Holdings, owns over 24 commercial properties in this county, with a total value exceeding $8 million. $8 million. I'd inherited not just a ranch, but a commercial real estate empire. Marcus flipped to another page. But here's the really interesting part. Triple J Holdings owns the Meadowbrook Commons Shopping Center. I recognized the name immediately. It was the commercial development that served the Meadowbrook Estates residential community. The shopping center, where their community center is located, not just located, the HOA rents their community center space from Triple J Holdings. They also rent their administrative offices and their maintenance facility. Marcus grinned. Jake, you're not just their neighbor. You're their landlord. The implications hit me like lightning. Catherine Wexford and her HOA board were paying rent to fight me. Every monthly HOA fee collected from residents partially went to maintaining facilities owned by the man they were trying to control. Marcus, do they know? The rental agreements are with Triple J Holdings, LLC. Unless they specifically research the ownership structure, they'd have no reason to know you're the beneficial owner. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Jake, you just inherited a very powerful position in this dispute. For the first time since meeting Catherine Wexford, I smiled. That night, I dove into every document related to Triple J Holdings and the Meadowbrook Estates development. What I discovered made my blood boil and my sense of justice sing simultaneously. The shopping center lease agreements were fascinating reading. The Meadowbrook HOA paid $8,000 per month for their community center, $3,200 per month for office space, and $2,400 per month for maintenance facilities. Nearly $14,000 per month flowing from the HOA to my grandfather's company. But the rental agreements contained standard clauses about property use and tenant behavior, professional conduct requirements, restrictions on illegal activities, termination clauses for breach of contract. I spent 3 days researching Texas property law and HOA regulations. What I found was a web of questionable practices that would make any landlord nervous about their tenants. The Community Standards Agreement Catherine had shown me was just the beginning. The HOA had been systematically expanding their control over surrounding properties through a combination of legal manipulation and financial pressure. They'd approached 4 other landowners with similar agreements, essentially creating a private kingdom where they controlled land they didn't own. Even worse, I discovered that several HOA board members had business interests in the development company that had built Meadowbrook Estates. Catherine Wexford's husband owned the landscaping company that had an exclusive maintenance contract with the HOA. Patricia Hendrick's son ran the property management firm that collected HOA fees and managed common areas. They weren't just controlling neighbors, they were profiting from it. But my research also revealed something else. The HOA's financial situation was precarious. The monthly rental payments to Triple J Holdings represented nearly 30% of their total budget. If those rental agreements were terminated, the HOA would lose their community center, offices, and maintenance facilities, effectively destroying their ability to function. Catherine Wexford had no idea she was threatening to evict herself. I decided to start subtle. On Monday morning, I called Jennifer Hayes, the property management company that handled rentals for Triple J Holdings. Jennifer, this is Jake Richardson. I'm the new beneficial owner of Triple J Holdings, and I need to discuss the Meadowbrook HOA rental agreements. Jennifer had managed the properties for 10 years and knew every tenant personally. Oh, the HOA folks. Their good tenants always pay on time, keep the facilities clean. Is there a problem? I need you to schedule a routine property inspection of all their rental spaces. This week. Any particular reason? Just want to make sure everything is in compliance with the lease terms. Professional conduct requirements, proper use of facilities, that sort of thing. Jennifer paused. Jake, is there something I should know about? Let's just say, I want to make sure our tenants are operating within the bounds of their rental agreements. Tuesday morning, Jennifer conducted her inspection, while Catherine Wexford and Patricia Hendricks watched nervously. They had no idea why their landlord was suddenly interested in their operations, but they clearly didn't like the scrutiny. That afternoon, Catherine called me directly. Her voice was strained, the honey-sweet tone replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Jake, I understand there was some kind of inspection at our community facilities today. Is there a problem we should know about? Inspection? I'm not sure what you mean, Catherine. The property management company said the building owner requested a routine compliance check. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Oh, that. Just standard landlord maintenance, I'm sure. Nothing to worry about if everything's in compliance. Landlord maintenance? Who? Who owns the shopping center? I believe it's owned by Triple J Holdings, LLC. Nice company, from what I hear. Very professional operation. Another pause. I could practically hear Catherine's mind racing, trying to connect dots she didn't know existed. Well, I'm sure everything is fine, she said finally. But Jake, we really do need to discuss the ranch situation. The board has been reviewing your compliance with the Community Standards Agreement, and there are some concerns. What kind of concerns? We've noticed some irregularities in your property maintenance. fence repairs that don't meet community standards, potential plans for livestock that would violate noise ordinances. The board feels we may need to escalate the situation if we can't reach an accommodation. The threat was clear: comply or face legal action. What Catherine didn't realize was that she'd just threatened to sue her own landlord. Catherine, I appreciate your concern for community standards. I hope the HOA continues to maintain the same high standards in all their operations. Of course we will. We're very committed to professional conduct and legal compliance. I am sure you are. Have a great day, Catherine. As I hung up, I realized Catherine had just handed me the perfect opening for what came next. Thursday morning brought Catherine's first real taste of what she was up against, though she still didn't understand what was happening. Jennifer Hayes called an emergency meeting with the HOA board to discuss concerns raised by the property owner regarding tenant activities. The meeting was scheduled for their community center, which seemed fitting they'd be discussing their fate in a building they didn't know belonged to their enemy. I parked across the street and watched through binoculars as Catherine, Patricia, Robert, and 2 other board members filed into the community center, looking like prisoners walking to their execution. They knew something was wrong, but they had no idea what. Jennifer entered 10 minutes later carrying a folder that I knew contained documentation of everything I'd discovered about the HOA's questionable practices. The meeting lasted 2 hours, with voices occasionally rising loud enough to hear through the windows. When the board members finally emerged, Catherine looked like she'd seen a ghost. Patricia was clutching her purse like it contained a lifeline. Robert appeared ready to quit on the spot. Jennifer called me an hour later. Jake, I have to ask, what exactly is your relationship with this HOA? They're neighbors. Why? Because when I mentioned that the property owner had concerns about their compliance with professional conduct requirements, Catherine Wexford went white as a sheet. She kept asking who owned Triple J Holdings and whether their rental agreements were secure. What did you tell her? The truth, that the beneficial owner preferred to remain private, but was committed to maintaining professional relationships with responsible tenants. I grinned. And how did they respond to that? Catherine asked 3 times whether there were any issues with their tenancy and whether the owner had any specific concerns about their operations. She seemed terrified that they might lose their rental agreements. The irony was delicious. Catherine was panicking about losing facilities rented from the man she was threatening to destroy legally. She was so focused on controlling my ranch that she'd never considered who controlled her HOA's infrastructure. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. I wanted Catherine to make the first move in escalating our conflict, because once she did, I'd have all the justification I needed for what came next. Friday afternoon, Catherine delivered exactly what I was waiting for. A certified letter arrived at the ranch containing a formal notice of community standards, violation, and a threat that would seal her fate. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It cited 17 alleged violations of the Community Standards Agreement, from unauthorized fence modifications to planning agricultural activities incompatible with residential community standards. Each violation carried a $500 fine, totaling $8,500 in penalties. But the real poison was in the final paragraph. Failure to remedy these violations within 30 days will result in the HOA pursuing all available legal remedies, including, but not limited to, injunctive relief and forced sale of the non-compliant property. Catherine Wexford had just threatened to force me off my family's land via legal action. She'd put it in writing, certified mail, with legal letterhead. She'd given me everything I needed to destroy her world. I called Marcus Webb immediately. Marcus, they just handed us the nuclear option. What do you mean? Catherine sent a certified letter threatening forced sale of the ranch if I don't comply with their HOA demands. She's officially escalated this to legal warfare. Explain that to me. The rental agreements with Triple J Holdings contain standard clauses prohibiting tenants from engaging in activities that could harm the landlord's interests. Threatening to force sale of your property definitely qualifies as harmful activity. I felt a surge of adrenaline. So I can evict them? You can terminate their rental agreements with 30 days' notice for breach of contract. Catherine just gave you legal justification to shut down their entire operation. But I had a better idea than simple eviction. I wanted Catherine to understand exactly what she'd done and who she'd been fighting. I wanted her to realize that her quest for suburban control had led her to threaten the one person who could destroy everything she'd built. I wanted her to know she'd been fighting her own landlord. Monday morning, I called Jennifer Hayes with instructions that would begin Catherine's nightmare. Jennifer, I need you to call an emergency meeting with the Meadowbrook HOA board. Tell them the property owner of Triple J Holdings has concerns about recent activities that may violate their rental agreement terms. What kind of concerns? Tell them the property owner has received information that HOA board members may be engaging in activities that conflict with their responsibilities as tenants of Triple J Holdings properties. That's pretty vague, Jake. That's the point. I want them nervous and confused. Schedule the meeting for Wednesday at 10 a.m. in their community center. Should I mention the property owner will be attending? No. Just say a representative of Triple J Holdings will be present to discuss the situation. Wednesday morning, I dressed in my best suit and drove to the Meadowbrook Commons shopping center. The community center sat at the far end of the strip mall, with windows facing the parking lot. Through those windows, I could see Catherine, Patricia, Robert, and 3 other board members sitting around their conference table, looking like defendants waiting for a verdict. At exactly 10 a.m., I walked through the front door of the community center. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, dawning horror as she realized what was happening. "Good morning, everyone," I said, setting my briefcase on the conference table. "I'm Jake Richardson, beneficial owner of Triple J Holdings, LLC. I understand there are some issues we need to discuss." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Robert stared at the table like he was trying to disappear into the wood grain. Catherine's perfectly styled composure cracked like ice under pressure. "You," she whispered, "you own our facilities?" "I own this community center, your administrative offices, your maintenance building, and about 20 other properties in this county. But yes, Catherine, I'm your landlord." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder. "And according to these rental agreements, you've been excellent tenants. Until now." "What do you mean, until now?" I pulled out the certified letter she'd sent me. "Yesterday, I received a legal threat from one of my tenants. A threat to pursue forced sale of my personal property through legal action. That's what we call a conflict of interest." The color drained from Catherine's face completely. She understood now she'd been threatening to destroy her own landlord's property while paying him rent for the privilege of doing so. What followed was the most satisfying conversation of my life. For 45 minutes, I methodically explained to Catherine Wexford exactly how she destroyed herself through her own greed and arrogance. "You see, Catherine, when you manipulated my sick grandfather into signing that community standards agreement, you thought you were gaining control over land you didn't own. What you actually did was threaten the financial interests of the man who owns the buildings where you conduct all your business." Patricia finally found her voice. "Jake, surely we can work something out. This is all a misunderstanding." "Is it a misunderstanding, Patricia?" "Because according to this certified letter, the HOA is prepared to pursue all available legal remedies, including forced sales of my family's ranch." I looked around the table. "That doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. That sounds like a declaration of war." Robert cleared his throat nervously. What are our options here? I pulled out another document. Well, Robert, your rental agreements contain standard clauses about professional conduct and activities that could harm the landlord's interests. Threatening to force sale of your landlord's primary residence definitely qualifies as harmful activity. Catherine's hands were shaking now. You can't evict us over this. We have rights as tenants. You have the same rights as any tenant who threatens their landlord, Catherine. Which is to say, you have the right to find new facilities within 30 days. The room erupted in panicked voices. Patricia started crying. Robert began frantically taking notes. Two other board members started arguing about whether they could afford alternative facilities. But Catherine wasn't finished. Even facing the destruction of everything she'd built, her arrogance wouldn't allow her to surrender. This is extortion, she hissed. You can't use your position as our landlord to coerce us into abandoning legitimate legal rights. Legal rights? I laugh. Catherine, let me explain something about legal rights. You have the right to pursue legal action against me over the Community Standards Agreement. And I have the right to terminate rental agreements with tenants who engage in activities harmful to my interests. Both of our actions would be perfectly legal. So what happens now? Now you have a choice. You can withdraw your legal threats against the ranch, dissolve the Community Standards Agreement, and continue renting these facilities. Or you can continue your legal warfare and find new places to conduct HOA business. Catherine's face twisted with rage and defeat. She'd built her little kingdom on the foundation of manipulating desperate landowners, never imagining that one of those landowners controlled the infrastructure she needed to operate. How long do we have to decide? You have until 5 p.m. today to withdraw the violation notice and legal threats. If I don't receive written confirmation by then, you'll have 30 days to vacate all J Holdings properties. I stood up and closed my briefcase. Catherine, you taught me something valuable about reading contracts and understanding power dynamics. Consider this my graduation present to you. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, I received a hand-delivered letter from the Meadowbrook HOA board. The letter, signed by all 5 board members, withdrew all violation notices against the ranch and formally dissolved the Community Standards Agreement that had bound my family's property to their suburban fantasies. But Catherine couldn't resist one final act of spite. At 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before my deadline, she called with venom in her voice. Congratulations, Jake. You've won. But don't think this is over. We'll find other facilities and we'll continue operating the HOA. We'll make your life miserable in every way we legally can. Actually, Catherine, there's something else we need to discuss. What now? I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records, and I noticed something interesting. The monthly rental payments to J Holdings represent about 30% of your total budget. When those agreements terminate, how exactly do you plan to afford alternative facilities? The silence on the other end told me everything. Without the community center for meetings, offices for administration, and maintenance facilities for equipment, the Meadowbrook HOA couldn't function. The monthly costs of replacing those facilities would bankrupt them within 6 months. You can't destroy an entire community over a personal dispute, Catherine said weakly. Then you'll have 30 days to find new facilities and figure out how to afford them on what's left of your budget after losing the rental income subsidy I've been unknowingly providing. Catherine hung up without another word. Within a week, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA began falling apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. Without their community center, they couldn't hold the monthly meetings required by their bylaws. Without their administrative offices, they couldn't process violation notices or collect fees. Without their maintenance facilities, they couldn't store equipment or coordinate common area upkeep. The breaking point came when Patricia Hendricks resigned from the board via email, followed within hours by Robert Talbot and the other two members. Their resignation letters all cited the same reason: irreconcilable conflicts between the HOA's mission and practical operational realities. Catherine was left as the president of an HOA with no board, no facilities, and no way to function. She tried desperately to find alternative venues, but the cost of renting equivalent facilities would have required doubling HOA fees, a move that required board approval she no longer had. On Friday afternoon, I received a call from Marcus Webb. "Jake, I just got the most interesting phone call. Catherine Wexford wants to schedule a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolution of community issues. Translation: she wants to surrender. That's my read on the situation. She's requesting a meeting at my office on Monday morning. Are you interested in hearing what she has to offer?" I thought about my grandfather, manipulated in his weakest moment by a woman who saw opportunity in desperation. I thought about the community standards agreement designed to control land she didn't own. I thought about the certified letter threatening forced sale of my family's ranch. "Set up the meeting, Marcus. Let's hear Catherine's final offer." Monday morning, Catherine Wexford walked into Marcus Webb's office looking like a woman who'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Her perfect hair was slightly disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, and her predatory smile had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd finally met a bigger predator. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "Catherine." I nodded to the chair across from Marcus's desk. "I understand you have something to discuss." She opened a folder with shaking hands and pulled out a document I recognized immediately: the Community Standards Agreement that had started this whole nightmare. "I want to formally dissolve this agreement," she said. "Complete nullification, with no restrictions or obligations on either party." "That's a start. What else?" Catherine pulled out another document: a formal dissolution of the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. "We're returning all property control to individual homeowners and eliminating all community standards beyond basic county ordinances." Marcus examined the documents while I watched Catherine struggle with what came next. There's something else," she said finally. "I want to apologize for how this situation developed. The agreement with your grandfather it wasn't our finest moment as a community organization." I leaned back in my chair. "Catherine, are you apologizing for manipulating a sick old man into signing away control of his family's land?" Her face flushed red. "The agreement was legal. The agreement was predatory, Catherine. You saw an opportunity to exploit someone's desperation, and you took it. The fact that it was technically legal doesn't make it ethical." She stared at the conference table for a long moment. "You're right. It wasn't ethical. I convinced myself we were protecting property values and maintaining community standards, but the truth is we were grabbing control over land we had no right to control." It was the first honest thing Catherine had said since I'd met her. "Why the change of heart now, Catherine? 2 weeks ago, you were threatening forced sale of my ranch. Because 2 weeks ago, I thought I held all the power. I thought you were just another landowner I could intimidate into compliance." She looked up and met my eyes. "I was wrong about the power dynamic. I was wrong about a lot of things." Marcus cleared his throat. "Jake, the dissolution documents look legitimate. Full nullification of the Community Standards Agreement, complete dissolution of the HOA, no ongoing restrictions or obligations." I studied Catherine's face, looking for any sign of the manipulative woman who'd ambushed me in her golf cart. What I saw was someone who'd finally learned the difference between authority and power. "Catherine, I have one condition for accepting this dissolution." "What condition?" "I want a written guarantee that no future HOA or community organization will attempt to impose restrictions on surrounding properties." If Meadowbrook Estates residents want to form a new HOA, they're welcome to do so, but their authority ends at their own property lines. Agreed. I looked at Marcus, who nodded his approval. Then we have a deal. 6 months after Catherine Wexford's surrender, life in our corner of Texas Hill Country had settled into something approaching normalcy. The Meadowbrook Estates development still existed, but without the oppressive HOA structure that had turned neighbors into adversaries. I'd kept my promise to honor Grandpa Joe's memory by making the ranch work again. The cattle operation was back in business, with a herd of 50 head grazing in the same pastures where my grandfather's cows had roamed. The morning sounds of lowing cattle and creaking windmills had replaced the diesel roar of golf carts and the crack of measuring tapes. Some of my former HOA neighbors had actually become real neighbors. Robert Talbot stopped by occasionally to help with fence repairs, grateful to be free from the constant stress of board meetings and compliance inspections. Mrs. Martinez, who'd never spoken during the HOA conflict, brought homemade tamales at Christmas and asked permission to let her grandkids fish in the creek. Even Patricia Hendricks had undergone a transformation. She'd started a small organic garden and asked for advice about sustainable farming practices. It turned out that, beneath the HOA tyranny, she'd always been interested in agriculture, but had been afraid to pursue it under Catherine's rigid community standards. Catherine herself had moved away within a month of the HOA dissolution. She'd put her house on the market immediately after our meeting and relocated to a planned retirement community in Arizona, where, presumably, someone else handled community standards enforcement. The house had been purchased by a young family from Houston Maria and David Santos, with twin daughters who loved exploring the countryside. They'd knocked on my door their first weekend to introduce themselves and ask about local wildlife. No clipboards, no measuring tapes, no violation notices. Just neighbors being neighborly. One evening in late September, I was sitting